Back in 2020, Dr. Melissa Berkeley published an article for Psychology Today entitled, "Do You Have a Racism Blind Spot?" She concluded that when people assess their own traits, they base their judgments on peak positive performance. I'm a better average baseball player because I played that no-hitter game last year. But when people assess someone else's behavior, they base their judgments on the average of all performances. Sure, she pitched that no-hitter, but her overall pitching average is not that great. In essence, we use two very different psychological processes when judging ourselves versus others. By the way, this article can be found on the culture cart outside. When we ask ourselves, am I a racist? We likely think of the times we behaved in a non-racist, egalitarian way and weigh these few instances more heavily than when we're making our assessment. But when we ask ourselves, are they a racist? We look at that behavioral evidence more even-handedly. This article brought to mind my grandfather, the Orange County tomato and lima bean farmer. Popo was a hard-working man whom I respected and knew to be a bit racist, but he was old, and I loved him, so I thought, well, okay. Our family told stories of how he helped the people that he worked with. Valentino had a sick child in Mexico. Popo loaned Valentino $600 and gave him 3 weeks off to take care of his daughter. The other farmers chided Popo because who would ever do such a thing? They called him foolish and said he would never see the money or the worker again. Back in the 60s, worker was not the word. It was a much more derogatory term that was used. But the other farmers were wrong. Val came back. I used to play with Val Jr., and this was a story his family told as well. One thing that's further back in the family treasure trove is how Popo helped a Japanese farmer who had been rounded up after Pearl Harbor. That was long before my time, but still a recounted story. See, even though Popo had been a flight instructor during World War II, he thought it was wrong that a family might lose their farm, so he helped work their land during the family's incarceration. I had always been very proud of these stories, but I have learned that one problem with them is classic white supremacy, a male savior, the white-centeredness of it all. Yes, I played on a slip and slide with Val Jr., but I didn't really know him all that well. His sick sister and the experience of his family was buried in the story behind my grandfather. As I began to read and learn about my privilege and the systemic racism in our country, I started to see examples in my own proud history that is anything but. Do we know what happened to the Japanese family that was incarcerated? No. So how could I have bragging rights to their story? Oh, because my white grandfather was the hero of the story, naturally, and by association, that makes me not a racist, right? After our first child, Grayson, was born, we hired Tomasa Norma Cuevas as our live-in nanny. It was perfect. I could practice my Spanish while this young Mexican woman learned English and cared for our darling baby. And because I remembered the trouble the vice presidential candidate, do you remember, Geraldine Ferraro got into by hiring an undocumented housekeeper, I photocopied Tomasa's green card and social security papers. I did my part. A few years later, we were planning a trip. Tomasa had gone camping with us before, but this time she was very reluctant. "What's the big deal?" I asked. "We're just going to San Diego." And then I saw the tears coming down as she shared that her papers weren't real. Honestly, my first thought was, oh my gosh, what if my employer finds out? Will I get in trouble? I was not an elected official. My work situation didn't matter. What really mattered was that this wonderful woman, taking care of our now 3 kiddos, was living her life in daily fear of deportation. That was the turning point for me. I finally saw our nanny as the person she is, not what I thought we knew. We sat down and asked her what we could do to help her get her papers. Turns out, she'd always disliked her first name, and she asked us to call her Norma. Norma had a plan and had been saving for a lawyer, but was terrified of starting the process because it could put her family members in risk. Many were here legally, but some were not. She allowed us to walk beside her on the journey that showed us up close and personal how difficult it is to move from being an illegal alien to a legal immigrant. We had to unlearn so many assumptions. Norma speaks Spanish, yes, but she does not identify as Mexican because she is an indigenous person of Mayan heritage and her first language is Zapoteca. We had lived together, yet we knew so little about her because we hadn't really talked about the things that mattered to her. The path to getting her papers was long. Shout out to now past member John Alcorn and his law firm for their help. We hear in the media complaints about immigrants taking jobs that people want here. Ha! So not true. One of the many steps to getting a visa is advertising the job for several weeks. I learned in both my professional work and in assisting Norma, no one responds to these jobs. No one wants them here. But here I go again, telling my white hero story. Darn it, I'm making me the center of this story. It's very hard to change behaviors. Norma is here legally after a 10-long-year process, and she is doing well. And she raised 3 amazing children. And she said to say hi because she couldn't be here today. Being a part of the Tapestry Racial Justice Task Force is helping me be more of the kind of person I want to be. This work is hard. We are having to learn many new things, unlearn things, and sometimes we white people hurt our friends of color. I care about Tapestry and the people here. This racial justice work really is important. So I conclude back at Dr. Berkeley's article, quote, "The bad news is that blind spots are hard to overcome. It's hard to change something that you cannot see. But knowing you have a blind spot is the first step in overriding this bias. Another good step is listening to those around you. If someone accuses you of saying or doing something racist or sexist or homophobic, your first gut response will be to deny it. I am not a racist. I'm a good person, you may say. Or, I'm a liberal. I can't be racist. We did not plan our talks. I didn't know what you were going to say. Instead, force yourself to stop. Take a pause and really assess your behavior. Ask yourself, if I saw someone else do the exact same thing, would I consider them a racist? Chances are you would.
Thank you, Liz, for sharing a bit of your story about your path to doing this complex work of racial justice. Your story of Popo is really a good segue into what I'm going to share. Good morning. I'm going to share a piece of history that's painful for me. I'm going to try to get through this. I'm not going to apologize for being a Debbie Downer. Let's see. I'm going to introduce a piece of history about the relatives. It's all of my relatives and over 125,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry faced during the mass incarceration of World War II. In the aftermath of this atrocious chapter in U.S. history, we Japanese Americans kept quiet for decades in our efforts to assimilate and prove our loyalty as good Americans. Although I am fortunate to have been spared by one generation the trauma of being forced to exchange my home and livelihood for an incarceration camp, I vicariously experienced the shattered lives and broken spirits of my ancestors through their untold stories. For the most part, we are the first generation to speak up about the shame, anger, and indignity our parents and grandparents felt at having to pay for a crime they did not commit in the country they called their own. As the language of oppression becomes less transparent and we look upon the wider arc of our history shaped by xenophobia and racism, it is important that we never forget this historical stain in our history. For decades, never again has been the rallying cry for us Japanese Americans. Invoking these words, reminds us of the trauma of our own communities, targeting and wrongful incarceration. It channels that trauma into action to defend and stand in solidarity with the rights and liberties of all marginalized groups. Much gratitude to Dave Kinnear and our AV team for making it possible to view the following photo montage incorporating Kishibashi's Violin Tsunami. It is a glimpse into the history of Japanese American immigration to incarceration. Arigatou gozaimasu.
When in song we are blessed to be, mending the rift of our apathy. I answer you remain. Days will end after the end of the cancer.
Thank you to Liz and Hiroshi for your powerful words. Hello, my name is Hannah Carey, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm going to share a poem about racism with you in a minute, but first I want to tell you about some mistakes I made while writing the poem. I wrote the first version of this poem in 2018. My first mistake was centering myself. The point of the poem in that form was just to demonstrate my racial awareness. It had an "I'm not like other white people" defensiveness to it. The second mistake I made was in skipping a step. I skipped the step of asking other white people committed to anti-racism to read the poem and give me feedback, to let me know if anything I put in the poem was missing the mark. White people need to talk to other white people about racism. I'm glad to tell you I did not skip that step this time. Thank you to my friends who gave me feedback on the poem. The third mistake I made was to ask my friend, Ashley Hayes, to read the poem and give me feedback. Ashley is a Black poet. She's phenomenal. Look her up, buy her books. And I asked her if she thought it would be okay for me to read this poem at an open mic. Now, this mistake is complicated because while white folks need to listen when a person of color says that something is harmful, we should not be asking people of color to help us understand racism. Teaching about racism is work. Ashley graciously gave me feedback. She shared that one line in the poem might be triggering to others. I removed it. She also told me that she felt conflicted about the poem. On the one hand, she felt that I should use my privilege to talk about racism by sharing the poem. But on the other hand, she felt that I should use my privilege to make space for a marginalized voice, such as a poet of color who wanted to share poetry about racism. I thanked Ashley and left the poem alone for several years. I think that was a good response. Then in 2020, I revisited the poem. I centered it less on myself and more on things I had learned since 2018 about systemic racism and white supremacy. I made it more of a teaching poem with an intended audience of other white people. Like I said a minute ago, it is the job of white people to talk about racism with other white people. The 2020 version of the poem is very similar to what I'm going to share today, but today's version is shortened for time. I returned to the poem last summer and noticed some mistakes I hadn't caught before. When I spoke of people of color in that version, I used the term Black and brown people several times and neglected to mention some groups by name, such as Asian and Pacific Islander people. As I continue to learn about racism and erasure, it feels very important to me to name these groups specifically and to use more inclusive terms like people of color and BIPOC instead of Black and brown people. So, those are some of the mistakes I have made so far with this poem. I tell you all this not because I need to publicly apologize or punish myself, but because I want you to know that the learning around racism doesn't stop. The best things we can do when we make mistakes are, 1, listen to feedback graciously, and 2, figure out what we're going to do differently next time. Now I'm going to share my poem. This poem is called Whitest Girl You Know. White girl has no rhythm. White girl claps on 1 and 3. White girl always sings along too. Don't stop believin'. White girl strives to treat everyone equally. White girl thinks she is colorblind. White girl thinks that is good. White girl has Black friends. White girl voted for Obama. White girl can't be racist. White girl grew up in a white supremacist culture. American culture is a white supremacist culture. White girl grew up swimming in it, didn't even notice. White girl absorbed stereotypes about Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian and Pacific Islander, and multiracial people, an attitude centering whiteness as the default, assumptions about whiteness as deserving, whiteness as better. White girl absorbed white supremacy. White girl learns that being white gives her privilege. to be represented in the media in positive and complex ways, to be called on by the teacher, to be more likely to get a job interview based on the white-sounding name on her resume. Whatever wealth or connections or talent she does not have, white girl has white privilege. White girl checks her privilege. White girl educates herself. I am white girl. Here is some of what I have learned. We are the heirs to a system which continues to inflict harm on people of color while benefiting white people. This is a time for accountability. So let's talk about racism. I am not saying we should not talk about gun control and climate change and violence against queer and trans people and limits to reproductive rights. We should. And we should talk about all the reasons why people of color are disproportionately impacted by all those things. I'm saying that our society, by its very structures, systemically dehumanizes and devalues people of color through racist policies that create barriers to wealth and home ownership and disenfranchise non-white voters and propel children of color from schools to prisons. I am not saying we should not talk about other important issues. I'm saying that right now, let's talk about racism and its intersection with human rights. There's a saying I saw on the internet. Equal rights for others does not mean fewer rights for you. It's not pumpkin pie. Meaning, equality is not finite. There can be abundance, but we must use our whiteness to make room at the table for BIPOC people, to make quiet, to hear BIPOC voices. We white people are not asked to give up our rights. The things we must give up are comfort, willful ignorance, inaction. White girl became a woman, being told by society how special she is, how she must be protected. I am a white woman. I curl my fingers around my privilege. We have work to do.